it's a great honour to have the opportunity to deliver this lecture. And because I was a Jean Monnet myself, a Jean Monnet Fellow back in 1997-98, so 20 years ago, in the Schuman Centre, that was then directed by Professor Mény, and I participated in a European Forum on International Migration. And I think it's fair to say that everything that I've been able to do as a researcher since then was linked to the 10 months that I spent in the Schuman Centre, in the Convento, as a Jean Monnet Fellow. And I think I'm one of very many people who've benefited from the fantastic environment created in the Schuman Centre, particularly for early career researchers, giving us, I think, a sense of what it is we should be doing, and also allowing us to collaborate with other people and work across disciplinary boundaries. So that's the great advantage we have here in the Schuman Centre. It's a fantastic environment, and it's an honour for me to be able to speak today with Professor Mény here. So, as Philippe said, since I'm now the director of the Migration Policy Centre, which is a more recent creation. So those who aren't familiar with the Migration Policy Centre, that was set up in 2012. But it was a consolidation of work that was already going on migration within the Schuman Centre and in various departments. And it's a great honour to be the director of the Migration Policy Centre, and also quite a significant responsibility. Because as you hopefully know, and if you don't know, hopefully you'll have the opportunity to find out, the MPC is a multidisciplinary centre which is focused on the challenges and opportunities of global migration and asylum. And we all know it's a key, important issue, politically salient. There's a lot of public debate about migration, but what we aim to do is more fundamental research on the drivers of migration, and to understand more in a kind of fundamental way about social, political and economic responses in European countries to migration. And we look at migration in all its diversity. It comes in many forms, and we are aiming to be global in our focus. And what we aim to do as well in the Migration Policy Centre is support a wider vision of developing advanced policy-oriented research within the Schuman Centre and the wider institute. So today, as Philip said, my talk is on the drivers of migration governance, which is work that's supported by the European Research Council, and I have some slides which I'll now activate, if I can work out how to do it. How do you start the slide? Oh, it's that one.
Oh God, my glasses are
Yeah.
so bad. Here, go here.
Sorry. Excuse.
So, no, this one. No.
Oh,
Yeah.
we're
Sorry.
making progress, but in the wrong direction.
Yeah, sorry about this.
Slideshow.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, it's there.
There we go. Right, sorry. Yeah. So technology isn't my strong point. So this talk what I'm going to talk about today is funded by the European Research Council, and I think it's important to recognise the generous support that ERC provides. It began at Sheffield University when I worked there before I came here a few weeks ago. But the seeds for this work were also sown when I was a Jean Monnet Fellow 20 years ago, and there were some great Jean Monnet Fellows with me, but one in particular I'd like to recognise was Professor Michael Bommers, who was at the University of Osnabrück, who sadly passed away in 2010. And Michael and I worked closely together, and we organised a conference here in this room on migration and the welfare state, supported by Professor Mény as director of the Schuman Centre. And in that book, what we try to do, and which I think has, as I said, sowed the seeds for what I'm going to talk about today, was to try to understand more about the way in which organisational settings give meaning to international migration. This also says something about how I, as a researcher, see and understand international migration. I think it's important to emphasise right from the outset that the way I work on international migration is not to see it as some kind of external challenge to governance systems in Europe, something that happens to them. It is, by definition, made visible by the borders and boundaries of states and by their governance systems. So without these borders and boundaries, there'd be no such thing as international migration. My research is focused on the organisational characteristics of governance systems to understand how they are constituted, and also how, through the constitution of migration governance, the issues and challenges associated with governance are defined. So I'm interested today in talking about the organisation of migration governance. The wider project is global in its focus. So the wider project is looking at migration governance in 4 regions, looking at the Asia-Pacific region and ASEAN, Europe and the EU, North America and NAFTA, and South America and Mercosur. I won't go into detail about our methods, but so far we've conducted around 350 interviews across those 4 regions, and our focus is on what could be called elite actors, those who are trying to shape, make, or influence migration policy. So today I'm going to focus mainly on Europe, but also some insights from our work in North America. So the objective is to know more about migration governance, and just to give you some insight, yesterday, I'm sure you all know, the Commission produced its communication on the delivery of the European Agenda on Migration. My job now is to read these things so that you don't have to. But the European Agenda on Migration is an important strategic document developed within the European Union in relation to the so-called migration crisis. And just to read the first paragraph, because I think this helps orient tonight's discussion, or this afternoon's discussion. In the last 2 years, I'm quoting, Europe experienced the largest number of arrivals of refugees and migrants since the end of the Second World War. The Syrian crisis played an important part in generating this record number, as did conflicts, instability and poverty in many parts of the world. Migration, asylum and border management systems were put under huge pressure. The Union and its member states were not sufficiently prepared to respond effectively. The scale of the crisis had a powerful impact across the EU. The integrity of both the common European asylum system and of the Schengen area of free movement for European citizens was put into question. Now, what I'm interested in, and as I'll explain later, is, in a sense, how European migration governance systems have produced this kind of understanding of what is going on. All organisations, through their actions and their inactions, their inclusions and their exclusions, are relating in some way to their environment, trying to make sense of their environment and trying to develop strategies in response to the changes as they see them. Now, I think this statement would be seen by many as a fair assessment of what's been happening in Europe in the last 3 or 4 years, and we're very familiar with that. But this first paragraph is very focused on crisis. The crisis linked to the conflict in Syria, instability, conflict, poverty in many parts of the world. And of course there are instability, poverty and conflict in many parts of the world. But that's not the only reason why people migrate. Most people don't migrate for those reasons. But also there's a you could call it a frame, a system in crisis, under pressure, unable to respond, a crisis of governance, a crisis of politics. And we're familiar with that. And that's not, you could say that that kind of frame has provided powerful understandings of the migration challenge in Europe. And I've taken that from a document published yesterday. As you'll see in the talk as I go on, there are other documents I can refer to, as well as our interview material, which I think help illustrate the theme that I'm interested in tonight, which is the way in which migration governance and systems themselves, because of the way they relate to the environment, to what's going on out there, produce understandings that themselves have shaping effects. So that's what I mean when I talk about the drivers of migration governance. So I think this matters because there is a tendency in migration studies, and perhaps in other areas as well, to focus on the outputs of governance systems, laws, policies, and such like, and to make assumptions about what it is that actors involved in these processes think they are doing. And what I think in the migration studies literature, it goes further than that, because there's a tendency to see migration policies as systematically failing. And one of the reasons for that, or one of the reasons that's developed to explain this systematic failure, is that people who are involved in making decisions on migration don't grasp the complexities and the dynamics of international migration. Or even worse, they don't listen to the academic researchers who claim to know what's going on. And so migration policies can fail to achieve their objectives. But I have a problem with this perspective on so-called policy failure. And it's not because I think policies succeed. It may be that some of these policy elites don't understand what's going on. Maybe they do. Maybe some do, maybe some don't. But that doesn't seem to me to be the point. The point is that we could at least try to find out what they think they're doing. And as a side note, methodologically, I don't think it makes sense to work back from the observed outcome of a process, the apparent failure, to then make assumptions about what it is that actors think they're doing and their motivations. I think you have to try to study the process. So that's what I mean when I say I'm talking, well, I keep saying tonight, this afternoon, I'm talking about the drivers of migration governance. It's been a long day. And so, I mean, this is quite an extensive initial throat-clearing exercise, but just so that people are aware what it is I'm not doing. I'm not trying to explain why people migrate, the drivers of migration itself. And I'm not trying to evaluate the outputs of migration governance systems, to evaluate policies and such like. These are all worthwhile pursuits, and I've contributed to them. I just want to look at things a little bit differently. And so these are the questions that I'm going to focus on. As I say, mainly in relation to Europe. And two questions, and essentially they are key questions in organisational studies. How do actors in migration governance systems organise their experiences of migration? So what's going on out there? And how does the organisation of these experiences shape action? What should we do next? Kind of quite simple questions. But in the area of migration studies, I'm not sure people have really looked into these kind of issues. And in fact, when I initially started discussing my European Research Council project, I was using some references in organisational studies, where obviously these kind of questions are at the core of that discipline. And I was accused of referring to very obscure work by sort of in this field of organisational studies, but maybe it said something about the kind of maybe migration studies as a field, that actually the perspectives I was drawing from in organisational studies are cited thousands, if not tens of thousands of times. The perspectives are very powerful, and I think can help me as somebody interested in migration understand more about the characteristics of migration governance as an organisational process. So our research for work that we've been doing has really been focused on trying to get a better understanding of these two issues: how actors understand what is going on out there, and also what, on that basis, what they think they should do next. So I'll just kind of clear some conceptual ground as well. I won't go into a lot of detail about concepts, but I will try and elaborate and explain a little bit more about what I mean as I go through, and maybe put some flesh on the bones of these concepts. What I'm talking about tonight is a kind of actor-centered perspective, but of course that involves some understanding of the agency of these actors. And I see the people that we talk to in our research as socially situated in particular organisational context, and also as socially constituted through their interactions. And as I say, I'll try and elaborate that with a few examples which talk about this social situation and social constitution of actors. But what it points to is that the relevance of social structural relationships, institutional processes, and also, importantly for what I'm going to talk about tonight, social cognition. I also have an understanding of governance, and governance is a phrase to which we often add describers such as multi-level or networked or deliberative, lots of words we add to describe governance. And we also know that governance can be a process, it could be a set of outcomes, it could be also a set of ideas. But what I do here, and if there was a footnote here and I was putting references on these slides, the reference here will be to the work of Jean-Pierre and the very influential book published, I think about in 2000, so about 17 years ago now, called Debating Governance, in which governance is ascribed a dual meaning: the conceptual representation of social systems and the empirical analysis of the capacity of these systems to adapt. So to explain how that relates to international migration, this understanding of governance, how that relates to international migration, I would argue that we need to understand that international migration is epiphenomenal. It only happens because other things change. So what are the changes that generate or could potentially generate international migration? Well, economic change, relative inequalities of income and wealth, political change, particularly conflict either within or between states, the role and operation of social factors, particularly networks within migration systems. Demographic change as well can be a potential driver of migration, and so too could environmental or climatic change. So what I would argue is that international migration occurs because other things happen, and that those involved in migration governance systems, either implicitly or explicitly, have to have some conceptual understanding of the effects and interactions between these underlying systems: economic, political, social, demographic, and environmental. So our research is interested in how actors make sense of potential causes of international migration and their effects. And this is where our focus on the organisational context of governance becomes important, because these understandings will, we argue, play a powerful role in the kind of social situation and social constitution of actors in migration governance systems, what they think is going on out there. So I'm going to try and, as I said before, try and develop these themes. It might seem a bit abstract, and I'll try and relate it now to what I mean when I talk about migration governance. So what I've got a series of essentially what are propositions for what I think migration governance is. And first it signifies change in underlying social systems. It necessarily requires some understanding at a conceptual level of the causes and effects of these changes, of what is going on out there, of the effects of economic change on migration, of political change, including conflict, of demographic, environmental, and social change. So that kind of maybe just refers back to a point already made. Second, migration governance is grounded in processes of issue framing. And as people here will know, a frame is a means of organising experience. It's an active process that, in the sense that something is being done, it's also dynamic and evolving. Frames are made through discursive processes that centre on talk, conversation, and written communication. They're also made through strategic processes that are more goal-oriented, such as building support for a view or a course of action. So much has been written in European migration governance about a prevailing security frame. Now, what our research also suggests is that there is a prevalent understanding, particularly in Europe, but also we found this in the US, of the pull exerted by labour markets and welfare states in major destination countries. There is a powerful pull bringing people to Europe because of the economic opportunities and perhaps also social rights that are provided. Now, what this then does is inform an approach to policy which emphasises deterrence, that people are moving to Europe because they're attracted by labour market and welfare state opportunities, and that what is then required is some effort to deter these. Now, what we find, and again, I'll explain a little bit more as I go on, is that this emphasis on pull factors then informs a response which emphasises deterrence. But as we also know, policies that only focus on trying to deter so-called push factors can make migration more costly, more dangerous, and particularly for those who would find it difficult to find regular legal pathways for migration. So a particular understanding of the causes of migration, this idea that there are powerful pull factors, is not in itself entirely implausible, but that particular kind of understanding does then drive certain kinds of action, which, as we can see, also have certain kinds of effects on migration itself. Migration governance also centres on relations between organisations and their environment. Migration governance is about picking up and responding to signals and cues from the environment within which organisations operate. It's relational because the signals and cues are used by organisations to develop an understanding of the challenges that they face. But the core problem is that these signals emerge from a very complex environment, and they may at times be inconsistent, and they may also even be contradictory. And as we know, choices and solutions in any area of governance do not emerge fully formed from the environment. And I was going to quote here from a book written in 1984 by Donald Schoen called The Reflective Practitioner. And what Schoen wrote was, well, when we set the problems, to quote, when we select what we will treat as the things of a situation, we set the boundaries of our attention to it, and we impose upon it a coherence which allows us to say what is wrong and in what direction the situation needs to be changed. Problem setting is a process in which interactively we name the things to which we will attend and frame the context in which we will attend to them. Now, I'll return to that point a little later when I talk about ideas of normality and a new normality in European migration governance. But I think that kind of perspective that Schoen developed, not writing at all about migration, is very important in understanding the kind of interactive characteristics of problem settings, the naming of things, then framing the context in which they'll be attended to. Migration governance, I would argue, is also inherently ambiguous, leading to a potential decoupling of problems and solutions. And the classic statement here, again, is from work that's not on migration, but I think is worth reflecting on. James March and Johan Olsen, who obviously are renowned scholars in the fields of organizational studies, wrote in 1976 that, to quote, most of what we believe we know about elements within organizational choice situations, as well as the events themselves, reflects an interpretation of events by organizational actors and observers. These interpretations are generated within the organization in the face of considerable perceptual ambiguity. And it seems to me that in migration governance I could identify three forms of perceptual ambiguity. First, competing pressures, for example, a demand from business for migrant labour, political demands for reduced immigration. 10 years or so ago, I wrote an article about Italy, migration in Italy, about how the 2001-06 government of Silvio Berlusconi, with participation from the Lega Nord and Alleanza Nazionale, adopted very strong rhetoric on immigration control and security, and then in office conducted probably the most generous regularization in Europe, and significantly increased the resident foreign population in Italy. And at the very least, this demonstrated the very big difference between what was said in elections, the kind of rhetorical framing of migration, and then what actually happened in coalition governments, where different pressures were exerted and a very large regularization of irregular population occurred. I think that was a kind of an ambiguity in migration governance. A second ambiguity arrives from the inherent complexity of the issues themselves. We organised in the Migration Policy Centre a meeting on African migration in the Commission last week, kind of what we call a high-level meeting, and we had a number of contributions from migration scholars from Africa. But one of the things that became very clear as they spoke, and maybe not a surprise to migration scholars, but it's very hard to pin down what is actually meant by international migration. As a category, immigration itself is analytically useless. There are very many different forms of migration, motives, duration of migration. It's quite a fluid concept, and the argument that the scholars from Africa was putting forward is becoming more fluid, more difficult to define. So there's an ambiguity linked to maybe the difficulty in actually pinning down what it is that is being done, a perceptual ambiguity at that level. And a third ambiguity is perhaps linked more generally to organisations and limits on their time, their ability or capacity to respond to their environment. There are constraints on time, attention, information and resources. But I'd also suggest in the area of migration, there's also perhaps an over-reliance on just piling up data, creating more and more data, and thinking that the numbers are telling us something. Maybe the most startling example of that is the net migration target in the UK, which may be the reason in itself why the UK is leaving the European Union, the decision about 7 years ago to introduce something called a net migration target, which never previously existed. But I think generally in the area of migration research, a focus on piling up more and more data within the Commission, great efforts are now being made to develop more data. What I would argue is that we also need to be able to make better use of that data. And a little plug here for something we're doing in the Migration Policy Centre. Obviously, we have many fabulous projects, and our website will tell you all about them. But last week we launched in Brussels an Observatory of Public Attitudes to Migration, which is trying to bring together data on public attitudes from across all member states of the European Union. Our intention is to go more global than that, because we're working with Ipsos, and we should be able to do that. But I think the issue here is that what we as researchers can do within the MPC, within the Schuman Centre and the EUI, is try and make sense of the data. I think one of the problems, as I said, in the area of migration research is the emphasis of piling up the data, and that by creating a mountain of data, that will in itself tell us something. And I think I'm not sure that it is necessarily helping. And finally, and I'm going to develop this point a little bit more, migration governance itself is inactive of what you could call sensible environments. And I'm taking this from the work of Carl Weick, who's, some of you may be familiar with his book, Sense Making in Organizations, which I've drawn on quite extensively. Again, if there were footnotes on my slides, then a key reference here will be to the work of Carl Weick and his book, Sense Making in Organizations. Now, what is a sensible environment? Well, at the risk of tautology, it's one that makes sense to actors and allows them to act. So it requires a combination of cognition, what's going on out there, and action, what should we do next? So I've tried to, I'm not sure that is quite, that might, even with my glasses on, I'm now thinking that wasn't a good font choice. Yeah, I can't even, I'm struggling to read that, and I'm sat next to the screen, so I will talk you through it. As you can see, PowerPoint slides aren't my strong point. So what that diagram is trying to look at is how actors in migration governance systems make sense of and create their environment. At the top, you've got a little circle in there in which are written the words beliefs and identities. Take my word for it. In one of the top circles are written the words beliefs and identities, which are constructed through interaction and the sharing of information and ideas. And I'm going to show how this works in a few minutes. You move to your right, you've got a green box. Well, this is a social activity because social processes shape interactions in the context of interpreting what is going on out there. Then you move down to a purple box. This is an ongoing process because people are always in the middle of things. Governance does not have a beginning and an end. You move around then to the, I guess that's turquoise, a turquoise box. So constructing or enacting this sensible environment is focused on and extracted by cues. Now, cues are simple, familiar structures that are the seeds from which people develop a larger sense of what may be occurring. And control over cues will serve as a point of reference and as an important source of power. You then move around to an orange box, and actions that emerge from these understandings and the extraction of cues. Actions establish boundaries, they draw lines, they create categories, and they label. And finally, moving around then, confusing with two red boxes next to each other, not sure how that happened, but there is a final box which says reliant on plausibility. The point here is that a sensible environment requires plausibility rather than accuracy. Accuracy is nice, but what counts for decision makers are plausibility, pragmatics, coherence, reasonableness, creativity, invention, and instrumentality. The understanding is not necessarily active. Decision makers aren't engaged in the search for objective truth. They need to extract some understanding of their environment, which gives them a plausible basis to act. So a sensible environment is plausible, not necessarily accurate. So I'm now going to explain, maybe move away from the diagram, go back to a simpler way of representing my ideas, using a quote here. So there's a little story here to explain this. Back in 2014, we were interviewing an official from an EU agency, which has responsibility for borders. You can probably guess which one. And this person said, well, yesterday at this meeting of the US and the Commission and others, they were repeatedly mentioning that this will be the new normal, these 250,000 to 280,000 irregular migrants a year, that's basically what we have to count on in the foreseeable future. And I assume everybody here can read. I don't need to read this all out to you, but you can see what the point that's made. You know, this person agrees with this. Things are going pretty badly in North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Afghanistan. And then, I don't see an end, unfortunately, to that, this person says. Now, whether accurate or not, this view is based on an understanding of the causes and effects of migration, of changes in underlying drivers, in this case, the effects of conflict. These changes are seen as likely to lead to persistently high migratory pressure, and also, in terms of kind of communication within governance systems, this emerged in discussions with the US. By the US, it means essentially the Department of Homeland Security. The EU and the US talk quite often and systematically about these questions. And there is a wider story could be told here about these means of communication within regional international migration governance. There are all kinds of formal and informal mechanisms to communicate information and ideas. So this isn't unusual. But this kind of understanding, I think, is of interest. And I'll show why I think it's of interest, because we jump 2 years forward. And this is a quote from a European Commission communication developing a new framework for action with, I think, what they call partner countries, which are non-EU member states in sub-Saharan Africa. And look, external migration pressure, apparently, well, that's the new normal, both for the EU and for partner countries. And this requires more coordinated, and then we go into a festival of jargon, coordinated, systematic, structured, synergies, leverages, etc. But you can see the point here. And what I'm trying to extract from this is a particular kind of understanding about what's going on out there, which is captured by this idea of new normal. That's a cliche. It's a word that's used to describe everything. But it is quite, I think it's quite striking that this word occurs. And it's over a 2-year period. There are other commission documents that we can refer to in which these kind of understandings are evident. And to return to an earlier point I made about framing, this, I think, or these two quotes can be seen as frames in action. There's a diagnostic element, which is the problem of external migratory pressure. There's a prognostic element, which is the continuation of this pressure, and also a motivational element, the need for strong external governance, working with non-EU countries to counter this problem as defined in this particular understanding. And I think this, in terms of an understanding, this is a highly plausible understanding within the European institutions. And in wider public debate, I think this would be an understanding of migration that really resonates. It's very plausible. Interestingly, in view of the use of language, we also interviewed a staff member of a US congressional representative. I can't do a US accent, so just imagine somebody speaking in a US accent for this. So I was talking to some folks the other day, and they think the new normal, if you will, of illegal immigration is somewhere in the 400,000 range. You know, irrespective of the word the new normal, maybe that's just a quirk given into you because it's such a cliche. But this kind of understanding, this kind of high continued migratory pressure of irregular, or as this US person put it, illegal immigration. Now, the point I want to make in relation to the drivers of migration governance is I think that this little vignette, and we have far more than this, but what I've tried to illustrate, I think this is how socialized actors create a sensible environment. It makes sense and it allows action. It's plausible. Beliefs and identities are shaped by interaction in an ongoing process that extracts cues from the environment to establish new boundaries, draw lines, create new categories. And as I say, it's a highly plausible understanding that resonates and has motivated considerable EU action. So if you were to look at the Commission's midterm review of its European agenda on migration, there are innumerable actions and initiatives and projects and funding lines established within this in pursuit of this kind of understanding of what's going on out there. just to develop that point a little bit more, and this was something that many people might put at the start of a talk about what's going on in Europe in terms of migration at the moment. Maps. Because maps, this kind of map has been central to the way in which the current so-called migration refugee crisis in Europe has been represented. And now there are many other maps of this kind. If you don't believe me, there's I think that's 31 more. And if you want to see some more, there's some more. Nice use of the castle there, fortress right on the top row, second from left. So this kind of representation of migration, these kind of maps have become quite commonplace. But to return to this map, this is a map from Europol. So it's a European agency. And it shows that people are moving from Africa to Europe, which is true. It also suggests really that there are no movements from Africa, at least from these parts shown on the map, other than towards Europe, which is not true. And this map could easily be supplemented by arrows that showed the significant movement occurring internally within African states, cross-border migration from one state to another, shorter distance movement, and of course south-south migration. South Africa has become a major migrant destination country. But the point I think I take from this is that the map gives the impression that migration to Europe is primarily by boat, primarily irregular, and it's true that this is an important issue. But even at the heights of Europe's so-called migration crisis in 2015, by far the most common way to enter Europe was regularly through air and seaports, to work, to study, to join with family members. Now, I think that this kind of map, this kind of understanding actually creates turbulence in governance systems, because the kind of outcome that results from this understanding results from some prior definition of a situation. So what does this mean for institutional processes? Well, the most obvious point in Europe, I suppose, is what is often referred to as the absence of solidarity. And so in the EU, we see an absence of solidarity in relation to the relocation of asylum seekers and refugees. But I would suggest that is symptomatic of other factors than itself being a driver of migration governance. Our research suggests that defensive and reactive tendencies in major destination countries are very powerful. And this can mean that decision makers tend to replicate structures or procedures that have been perceived as effective in the past, not necessarily successful, but effective. And there's a couple of quotes I've got which maybe put this word effective into context. But just to recount something that a European Commission official said to us in 2015, I think it resonates really with a lot of other people's views. This person said, it's very much, it goes in cycles. We hear the same discussion now that we heard 10 years ago, and we see the same responses now that we saw 10 years ago. It didn't work then, so I don't think it will work now. The normal strengthen the borders, Schengen, controlling, etc. I just don't think that's it's too simplistic, I think, unquote. And in two quotes from the US, I think really quite powerful about the consequences of intervention. This first quote is from something in the US Department of Justice during the time of the Obama administration. We have to go back to the US, but this is at the time of the Obama administration. And this person from the DOJ said, the first thing is its immigration policy is so reactive. Two is, it seems to be limping along just fine, so why rock the boat? If we rock the boat, somebody might see us and want to, make even more changes. And a Department for Homeland Security official was fearful of what he called opening the floodgates to new migration flows. So to quote, I think there's a reluctance to do anything that might make the flood start again. So maybe a risk aversion. Well, so we don't know what stopped the flood, so anything, all of the actions we took, we're hesitant to change, because any one of them could have been the one. So to try and bring this to a conclusion, what I've tried to do in this talk is to understand more about the drivers of migration governance, both conceptually and empirically. And that's meant trying to understand a little bit more about what I call situated and socialized actors, and also to know more about how they create these sensible environments in which they operate, that makes sense to them, and that create a base for action. The first point I'd make in conclusion is that the study of migration is not special. That might be bad news for those of us in the Migration Policy Centre. But the study of migration is not special. It's not a special case. If we want to understand migration governance, we need to understand more about governance. If we want to understand, migration is necessarily a multidisciplinary field, but it draws its strength from the perspectives it can draw from those multidisciplinary fields. And if we just stay in the Villa Malafrasca talking amongst ourselves, we won't get very far. The second point, I think, is that understandings of migration play a powerfully constitutive role in migration governance. So understandings of migration, its causes, its effects, of the risks and uncertainties associated with it, have powerful effects on what actions are then taken. So migration cannot be understood simply as some kind of external challenge to governance systems to which they must then respond. Through their actions, they play a powerful role in defining the challenge, in creating the categories, the labels, the understandings that inform action. A third conclusion is that actions and inactions, and also the assessments of the effects of these actions, help shape what it is that is being dealt with. And fourthly, just to illustrate what that third point means, essentially, in the context of major destination countries in Europe and North America, and I think you could probably include Australia here too, where we've also worked, this means defining what is normal, and on the basis of this, the limits and possibilities of action. So I'll conclude there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
So, do you still need some time to digest this? Yes, please.
If the migration is not a special topic for research. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for extremely interesting presentation. I have a question about the migration crisis. So why we speak about the migration or refugees crisis? What's the reason for that? Because if we see from the broader perspective, there is not a crisis, there is not a refugee, there is not a migration crisis. So because there is hundreds international migration in the world, and now we speak about the 2 million or maybe 2.5 million immigrants for 2 years for almost 20 countries in Europe, one of the most richest countries in the world. So why this is a migration, why crisis, why migration and refugees crisis? Your perspective, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Well, there is still a future for migration research, I can assure you. We've got to make it work. But I'm just, in a sense, it goes to the question I talked about a so-called migration crisis. We got in trouble last week because we put a slide online about our launch of our Observatory of Attitudes to Migration, where we used the word migration crisis and we didn't put in inverted commas, and a bit of a Twitter, well, relative. I'm hardly a Twitter phenomenon. There's a moderate Twitter storm around this. A crisis. What crisis? And I suppose what I've been arguing is that actually in wider public understanding of what is going on out there, I think there is a feeling that something has gone wrong. And so as a researcher, we'll say, well, perhaps the scale of movement is not exceptional. It's not massive compared to the European population, though let's not forget the loss of life, which is extraordinary. The horrific loss of life in the Mediterranean, incredible and tragic loss of life on a huge scale. So that, I think, there are reasons for thinking that is a crisis, that the deaths that are occurring in the Mediterranean. But I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that there is a plausible understanding of what is going on in European migration governance that has an understanding either implicitly or explicitly that this is a crisis, both of numbers and of institutions, a political crisis. So the very first quote I read from this midterm review of the European Agenda on Migration was really framed in terms of crisis, conflict, inequality, poverty, systems not working. So I think there is a powerful, prevalent understanding which extracts certain cues from the environment, what's going on out there, and creates a basis for action. And then we as researchers may say, oh, well, hold on. It's not really that, the scale is not so big. As Angela Merkel said, we can cope. We can do this. But I'm not sure that understanding cuts through in quite the same way. So I don't disagree with you, but I'm not sure that the kind of plausible understanding that resonates with policymakers is that, well, there's really not much going on here.
Andrew, thank you very much for your talk. And my question relates to where is the politics, because I was very struck by the fact that the drivers of migration governance did not seem to have any political input. And yet, if we look at both migration as an issue, it's clearly an issue in electoral terms. As a driver of political behaviour, it has an impact on how people vote. And I'm wondering, in all of those very extensive interviews you did with people who were working organisationally within the migration field or migration governance, where was politics for them?
Thanks, Bridget. Politics is a core. Political factors are core drivers of migration. There are two main drivers, economic and political. But I think the point you're making about party politics is an important one, because I suppose what we've mainly been talking to is about how people, or what we thought we were talking to, is about how people understand what's going on out there. And in fact, in the interviews, we've got a lot of quite rich material about how actors interpret the rise of populism, how they understand that as maybe constraining their actions. So certainly in Europe, we can see that politics or understandings of the politics have a constraining effect. We need to go back to the US and find out what's been happening there since the last time we were there 2 years ago. But maybe a wider point here as well, and it goes to our new Observatory of Public Attitudes to Migration, which is obviously very focused on the politics. And you could say, but what we find in our interviews is that actors feel constrained, particularly political actors from mainstream parties feel quite constrained in what they can do by the rise of populism. Although, as scientific researchers here, or academic researchers here in the EUI, what we've been able to show is that actually public attitudes on migration are far more nuanced than some of these understandings that focus on the rise of populism would suggest. So there's not a tidal wave of anti-immigration sentiment sweeping across Europe, far from it. Attitudes are stable, and if anything, becoming slightly more positive. But maybe what we then need to do as researchers is try and get that kind of understanding to cut through a little bit more into the policy debate.
Thanks, Andrew. I have two questions. One, what picks up on what you said at the very end, that we should really look at governance and not see migration governance as being something very special, different from the governance of other social phenomena. And again, my intuition is kind of to protest against this and using what you said initially, which is that migration in some senses is constitutive of what the modern state is. It's not an independent phenomenon out there, but migration doesn't exist if you don't have states that have borders and that categorize people as migrants. What exists independently of states and can be measured is, in a way, mobility, people moving in time and space. Yeah? But categorizing some forms of mobility as migration, is something that is an effect of state action. You see it very clearly in the EU. You cannot talk about migration when you refer to mobile EU citizens. They're not supposed to be migrants. They are something different, but they cross international borders. These borders happen to be internal in the EU, and therefore they are not migrants, they are mobile EU citizens. So there seems to be some feedback loop, between governance and migration that is constituted through governance as a specific phenomenon distinct from others, that does not necessarily, my naive view is maybe that doesn't apply in the same way to the governance of trade, finance, environmental issues, and maybe that's something that is not unique, but still in a way specific, this kind of circularity between governance and the phenomenon, the social phenomenon of migration. My second question is about this organizational studies perspective that you emphasize very strongly. I think there's a lot to be learned from this, but it's a strongly internal perspective. You try to understand how these people frame the phenomenon and work through it inside the organization and see what they have to do next, as you explained very well. But still, governance in the end, also includes action that has an impact on social phenomenon that it tries to govern. And one of these impacts might be on migration itself, and there may be the upshot of what you say is the impact is very limited and cannot be predicted very well, But there is another impact, and that brings me to what you're doing now, building up this observatory on public attitudes to migration. That is much more plausible, that migration governance, I would assume, has a strong impact on public attitudes towards migration, because it's also communicated. Governance uses discourses that then feed into perceptions and attitudes. You just said now, that attitudes seem to be rather stable, right? And not so much impacted by governance, which I would find a very surprising and important finding of your research. But still, the question is, in all of these issues, is governance leading or lagging, right? When it comes to changes of public attitudes. Is it driven by the perception of what the voters out there think about migration, or is it influencing this? And what's your view of that kind of feedback loop between public attitudes and migration?
Thanks, Rainer. I think the first question itself, you're right. I suppose there is in a sense, a tension, because I suppose the starting point for me as a political science interest in international migration is the work of Aristide Zolberg, and the point that he made about nearly 30 years ago about how we need to, international migration itself is constituted by the borders and boundaries of states. So I suppose what I was trying to do, maybe in more limited terms, was say that there are tools available for us to understand the operation effects of governance systems that we can apply in the area of migration studies. So I suppose what I was responding to more specifically was, say, the work of Stephen Castles, who's a very famous migration scholar who wrote an article called Why Migration Policies Fail. And his perspective was that they fail for all kinds of reasons, including there are hidden agendas, all the kind of things I spoke about earlier. And I just found that an implausible understanding, because it doesn't attempt in any way to actually deal with what is actually going on inside these governance processes themselves. So perhaps what I need to do is tease out this distinction you made between perhaps a more fundamental role that migration and mobility play, or of the relationship between migration, mobility and governance systems, and perhaps the more specific point I was trying to develop from what I thought was a kind of not a particularly convincing argument about migration policy outcomes based on no attempt to really pay any attention to governance systems themselves. The leading and lagging point, is a very good point. I suppose I'm not. In a way, that's the kind of question that I suppose the researchers we develop it will try to answer. My initial understanding, based on the work we've done so far, is that both of those things seem to be occurring simultaneously. The governance systems themselves are having quite powerful effects in shaping understandings, but also at the same time incorporating within their decision-making the cues that they're extracting. So I would see these as a simultaneous process, but I think actually what we might be able to do in future research is try and tease that out a little bit more. Because one of the things that's becoming pretty evident, and maybe relates to the point that you're making, is that is the kind of a co-option of the discourse of the radical and populist right into mainstream governance about, in a sense, maybe what is normal in migration governance has now been powerfully affected by populist and extreme right parties that are not in government, but have reshape mainstream debate. So I think that probably is one of the where the governance systems themselves are being led by their understanding of the wider political context.
Yes, I am Marco Incerti from the communications service here, and I spent the last several years rubbing shoulders with the policymakers who would churn out that kind of language. And so I have a question which brings together what Bridget was asking and partly also goes to the point raised by Professor Balbock now. You spoke about the piling of data and the fact that there's more and more data that is being produced and that it should be better used. In this respect, my question is, how can we make that data sort of available / used by policymakers? Because you spoke about your own country. Again, there's several accounts of how during the campaign it became clearer and clearer that migration was a salient issue, but no one could find evidence of the concerns of some of the Brexiters were warranted. So the data is there. There's also other examples, of course, benefit shopping and so on. There is already a wealth of information, but no one seems to be paying attention.
Well, I would suggest that part of it's a very good point. Thank you for that. I would suggest that part of the reason people find it difficult to, well, two reasons, sorry, why people find it difficult to pay attention. First, the amount of information out there on migration, which can be difficult to process and make sense of. And I think cumulatively we're adding more data to that. So the Commission, and I think in a very important, it's an important initiative, and I think it's valuable, but the Commission created a knowledge centre on migration and demography, which will mobilise more data. But the wider point there is then how to communicate that data. And if we want to, I suppose academic researchers themselves can maybe think about how they communicate information and try to represent the findings of their research in ways that make sense to a wider audience, the way that it's discussed, the way that they present the work. But I think there's, if you know, referring back, I'm not here to somehow represent the UK in any shape or form, but of course, you know, as somebody pointed out at a meeting we organised last week, a political crisis also generates a lot of data. And what we know is that the Brexit vote was dominated by two factors. First of all was immigration and nativism, and second, distrust of experts. So I think so data in itself can be valuable. Academics can play a role in communicating effectively and taking their responsibility. But also at the same time, experts may not be the most credible messengers. Now, I think there's a wider point here because people may know that the Joint Research Centre in the European Commission organised a conference this week on post-truth or post-fact politics. So there's a wider set of issues here about this communication. But I would suggest, you know, even as a narrow point in migration research, you know, that the Knowledge Centre on Migration and Demography has an impressive set of objectives. But I don't think it was really paying attention and maybe not alone in this, in how then these kind of messages are communicated in ways that resonate with the public. And the danger is if experts are seen as lecturing to people, telling them that they are wrong about immigration, they are ignorant and at worst xenophobic or racist, then actually it can be counterproductive.
My question is partly related to those which have been raised by Rainer and by Bridget. I have the feeling that you have rightly focused on the issues of frames of reference, how, in a way, the situation is defined by actors and what kind of policy can emerge from that, let's say, approach or definition. But actually, I would say that in the field of migrations, you have at least two very different frames of reference. You have the one which is set up by international organizations, bureaucratic organizations, which tend to say, well, there is a crisis, but there is a contradiction. There is a crisis, but the crisis is the new normal. So, where are we? Do we deal with a crisis, or do we deal with a new normality? And it would be very interesting from this point of view to, in particular in Europe, to have a closer look to the way this kind of common understanding is set up. I had the chance for a few months to work for one commissioner and to resign after a while because I thought it was absolutely useless exercise. But it was interesting because the commissioner was coming with new ideas about development policies. And I have observed from within how this attempt by the commissioner to inject new ideas or new visions were absorbed and destroyed by the bureaucracy. Because, in particular, these new ideas were not fitting with the rigidity of the system. That is, every 5 lines of any document has to be approved by 5, 6, 7, or 8 directorates, and it has to go through the machinery, and at the end you have not much of new in this so-called common definition, but which will become the official position at the end. Secondly, there is a lot of past dependency. So you might say the situation has changed, but you are dependent on your budget, on the chapters of your budget, on the line of the budget. So there is a lot of internal resistance to change, even if the people are conscious that something has changed. So this kind of, let's say, frame of reference is the result of many compromises within the bureaucratic machinery. So this is one side of the coin. That is a frame of reference which, for instance, will argue that mobility is a good thing internally, within the European Union, and even internationally. So academics move, Polish plumbers move, and it's already perhaps a bit more problematic for people. So there is this positive side of, and you have also a migration which is a kind of automatic migration. I think there are, let me take the case of the French situations. If I'm not wrong, there are about 200,000 migrants per year coming into France. But half of that, 100,000, are automatically accepted through the reunification of families. So in many ways, it's something on which governments have nothing to say or very little to say. They might resist, they might slow down the process, but they have nothing. Okay, so the other frame of reference is the frame of reference which is proposed by the populist parties, because they have been the only ones which have offered an alternative to the bureaucratic definition of migration, which sees migrations as more positive, increase of the national product, etc. They see it entirely negatively. And even if very few populist parties have been in power, they have set up the agenda. They are the agenda setters. They are not only framing the debate, but for a large part, they are also defining what is acceptable or not acceptable by politicians. So I think it would be worthwhile perhaps to analyze this kind of collision between two frames of reference. One which is much more bureaucratic, internationally minded, international organizations, etc. And the other one which is very much rooted in local politics. If you look at the recent German elections, for instance, you see that in the eastern part of of the country, and in particular in the Saxon part, Saxon-Länder, Dresden, etc., you have an extremely strong reaction, not to talk about France, where we have seen that a party like the Front National can get a lot of votes. So any government, even the most enlightened government, has to take into account this alternative frame of reference and compromise between these two. So there is not, unfortunately, there is not a common understanding of what migration is about, but you have a shock between, let's say, an economic, liberal, bureaucratic approach and a grassroots politics, populist approach, which propose a completely different view of what migration is about. So you are in between these two frames of reference, if I may say so, and like Bridget, I regret a little bit that politics have not come in more into your presentation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think this idea of two powerful frames of reference, the more bureaucratic frame and the more political frame, are things that we certainly find in our research. And I suppose, I think I could perhaps elaborate a little bit more, and I can certainly do so now. I think you're absolutely right in terms that there is the bureaucratic frame. And the kind of understanding that emanates from it. And we find that in the member states, at European level, we see the key mobilizing role played by international organizations in their pursuit of initiatives at global level. And as you say, there's also the grassroots kind of populist reaction against immigration, of course, against the political elites and against those who they see as out of touch. But it also suggests that there's a third area, which is perhaps more nebulous, and because this is quite a polarized vision of where, the kind of a bureaucratic and detached frame and the kind of more street level framing or understanding. I think there are many people in Europe, and I think the evidence is there to support it, who are somewhere in the middle. They have concerns about immigration, they see those concerns as legitimate. They don't see themselves as racist or xenophobic because they have those concerns about immigration. There are some people who are racist and xenophobic, relatively small numbers, but there are. But there are many people who are maybe perhaps more anxious and perhaps also more persuadable, somewhere in the middle. So if you think about this vision, I think you're absolutely right, the more bureaucratic frame, where I think there's a fear of the public, a fear of public opinion, a fear that people are just endemically hostile to immigration, and and what might happen if policies moved in a direction which upset people or allowed the populace to mobilise. And on the other hand, obviously, of course, the populace, as you describe it. But I think there's a section of the population who are persuadable. But they're persuadable, and our Observatory of Public Attitudes to Migration, now housed here in the Schuman Centre, really tries to look into this. They're persuadable in ways that appeal to their fundamental values. And so there's not much use trying to appeal to people who have more conservative social values by just telling them that mobility is good, diversity is good, multiculturalism is good, get over it. And if you don't agree, you're either wrong or racist. What is more likely to work with those sections of the population, perhaps who are between these two kind of polarized views, is an appeal which resonates in terms of their own values.
But there is a crucial issue of the gap between facts and perceptions. British or French are convinced that they are invaded by foreigners. But eliminate the foreigners and you have no construction industry in France. Eliminate the foreigners and you have no emergency service because 80% of the doctors are foreigners, etc. So these are facts, but the perception is they are taking our jobs.
Yeah.
But again, if you oust the foreigners, there is no entire sectors of the industry, which can't work. But this is not recognized as a fact by a large part of the population, which sees the foreigners as a danger. And there is no government which cannot consider these fears and the electoral consequences, because after all, politicians are dependent on elections. So it has a lot, which makes a very strange situation. Ambiguity, I think the word that you put on the table, ambiguity, is really crucial, because you have this ambiguity of perception and this ambiguity of policy reactions, because all migration policy are extremely ambiguous. On one hand, you give full health coverage to illegal immigrants, you educate their children, and you want at the same time to expel them. So, where are you?
No, I think that's a very good point. There's certainly this, but one of the things as well, there is a systematic gap at the level of perception. If you look at people systematically misunderstand the number of immigrants in a country. So there is that kind of perception gap across Europe.
Okay, we have 4 more people on the list, and in the interest of time, I think I will group them. So, could you start?
I actually work for the European Commission, so this has been fascinating. Thank you very much. So it's been fascinating to see how European Commission texts are then analyzed, and I would like to echo what Professor Mény said. You know, that the way or the governance of how these documents are actually made, I think, needs to be taken into account, because what happens is that a commissioner says, we will write this communication, then a desk officer starts writing it, then it goes through the hierarchy, it goes through inter-service consultation, then it goes to the SecGen, to the Secretary General, where it's trimmed down again. It becomes a Christmas tree in inter-service consultation and is then trimmed down in order to present it to the cabinet in a way that it is readable, let's say. And then the cabinets have an inter-cabinet consultation, because Commission decisions are collegial. So you then have another round of Christmas trees, which then goes back to the cabinet that is responsible, and we have an extra challenge because we now have a vice president's layer, which means the vice presidents feel equally responsible, like the commissioners in charge, for the end text. And then you get to a situation where basically the outcome is an enormous compromise and probably doesn't have to do much anymore with what the commissioner had originally in mind. And I think this needs to be taken into account when you look at word by word how a text is constructed. That's one point, so the structure and the governance of it. And then the second point is the focus on crisis. I think, echoing again what has been said, one has to take into account that the Commission and also the EU institutions in general have been challenged by being too far from the citizens. This is the assumption. The Brussels bubble is far from the perception of the real world. And so in acknowledging, I think that actually acknowledging the crisis in this way is a reaction also to the fact that as we see the rise of populism, there seems to be a perception of crisis, or at least this is what the Commission thinks, that people think that there is a crisis. So this is again how the word, I think, comes in it. And then I think one shouldn't forget, when it comes to the new normal, that we had a similar debate about 10 years ago on the globalization, where we said change is the new status quo. It's a bit it was a similar situation in order to convince the citizens, that this is here to stay. So thanks a lot. Thank you.
Well, I was actually had a factual question, but I just wanted to say something about this Yves' point that facts are stubborn things. of course, the people that tend to be anti-immigrant tend to be older people, who are, of course, the ones who have most at stake if they manage to kick the younger immigrants out, who are the ones that, after all, are going to pay their pensions in the end. And you have this rather absurd situation in England where they're planning to kick out 3 million young workers who are paying pensions in exchange for 1 million pensioners who move back to England, further overloading their healthcare system. But anyway, so the facts are stubborn things, whatever the perceptions might be. You pay the price for ignoring the facts in the end. My question actually was a question about facts, and I just want to come back to this issue that you raised about this horrific death rate crossing the Mediterranean. And I wonder if there's data to back that up. I couldn't find particularly good data, but it looked to me in sort of standard demographic terms that the rate is about 100 per 100,000. That's comparable. That's higher than a murder rate in a very high homicide country like Jamaica, which is about 80, but also much, much lower than a country at war like Syria, where it's about 400. So I don't want to argue that 100 is a good number, but then again, we don't spend our time talking about how horrific things are in Jamaica either. So it makes a bit of a difference whether my number of 100 is correct, which I don't wish to stand by. But
Okay.
Okay, so my name's Susan Kneebone. I'm a visiting fellow at the Migration Policy Centre, and my work is largely in Asia, and I've done a lot of work on human trafficking, looking at governance and so forth. So I wanted to ask you a question about elite actors, which probably follows on from some of these other questions, but I also wanted to defend Stephen Castles, because I think that what he was saying, which is what we are now saying too, is that there is a great dispute amongst scholars and amongst policymakers about what migration is actually about. And he was pointing out that in the 1990s, they couldn't quite decide whether migration fitted with population and development or human security. But my question was to ask you about who you mean by elite actors, and also to point out that in Australia, a comment was made just a little moment ago about migration and state action. In Australia now there's a tendency to try and bring in private actors. More and more the government is, for example, in the area of private resettlement of refugees, throwing it over to business. So I wondered, again, if you could explain who you mean by elite actors in this context, and whether that might include, for example, civil society as well as other private actors, because I certainly found in the trafficking context that gave you very different perceptions. But thank you for your very elegant speech. It was absolutely terrific.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, I don't want to load even more onto your plate at this point before we stop. But I was just curious, you mentioned, I think very briefly, the security frame, and I wonder how you see that in conjunction with both the bureaucratic frame, but also as a driver, in a sense, of migration governance at the European level, the linking of security with migration and the way that that is being operationalized currently at the European level, also at a very bureaucratic level, if you will, but through principles such as interoperability of data that apply both horizontally at the European level, but also in conjunction with the national level. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
In conclusion, I cannot resist to ask a question myself, and that's also about whether there is nothing special about migration studies. And my very pedestrian view is, compared to other modern policy problems, the special feature of migration is that it's very visible. Think of climate change. Climate change is constituted by experts and data. If it wasn't for the experts, you would just think it was a nice summer again this year. And only because there is data do you know, there might be a problem. Or think of the Eurozone crisis. It started with an expert sitting in front of microphones telling people, you may have believed our deficit is 3%. I tell you, I went through the data again, it's 12%. And then suddenly a crisis ensues. Now compare this to migration. People may have a very bad feeling for volumes, for proportions, but they see other people coming. You know, they live in their neighborhoods, they go to school with their children, and I think this very visibility is something special and may help to explain the political arousal levels that you achieve with issues of migration that you don't achieve with any other modern policy issue.
Now, finally.
Great, thanks. So in reverse order, so I'll agree, migration is special. No, but I think that visibility is interesting, because I'd also say that areas where people maybe are most worked up about immigration are often areas where immigrants don't live. So a lot of areas where people have hostility to migrants, effectively in the absence of migrants, and people live in areas in which there are migrants are less hostile. But I agree that I think you're right, the visibility. I suppose my point, it wasn't that, there's nothing maybe intrinsically interesting about the study of international migration. Maybe it was a point that what we need to do as scholars of migration is make sure that we integrate our work with what scholars in other areas are doing. So there may be some overlap with what we're doing and what people are doing who are working on climate. So I spent 2 years working in the UK Government Office for Science precisely on the intersection between migration and climate change. One, climate change less visible, one, migration more visible, but a very key and important relationship between them. And in trying to integrate the perspectives from both of those areas, those kind of transboundary concerns, I think is potentially very valuable. But we can agree that migration is special. The point about the Commission. So I'm not analysing. I mean, thank the Lord, I'm not analysing Commission documents word by word. I can promise you that. And in a way, that's what we're trying to understand. You know, the way these documents are formed. I've been involved in it myself. Precisely this work on climate, I was involved through some research in a staff working paper, and so you can follow this kind of process, and you can. And I've also been involved in a process where I think by mistake the track changes were left on one of these documents, so you can follow it in all its joy and see this process. So I appreciate that, and I suppose my exercise is not one of trying to unpick, from the first floor to the second floor to the third floor, then back down again, and all this kind of thing. But the point is an important one. That the point about what was going on 10 years ago and about globalization is interesting, and also referring back these kind of a way in which maybe anchoring assessments, something fixes in people's minds which provides them a frame of reference that they then use to think about what they might do in the future. So as another example of that, we were at a meeting last week, and a member of the European External Action Service exploded would be the word. It was a Chatham House meeting, and he launched into a very full and frank overview of his experiences, referring precisely to events of 10 years beforehand, incidents around the Canary Islands, and how they had fundamentally shaped his view of what was possible. This kind of anchoring assessment based on the situation in the Canary Islands with people trying to get there from Africa to Spanish territory. So I think that kind of these effects of previous events is quite powerful, and we certainly talk to people about those. David's point, well, if you wanted a data source, the IOM missing migrants, or IOM collects data through missing migrants. I've not looked at it in terms of absolute numbers, comparing it to the murder rate in Kingston, but it is the world's most deadly border. So compared to other border zones, the rate of death on Europe's borders is high. The level of numbers of people missing or dead is very high. I think it's I do see that as a kind of a very serious issue, but I take the point. If you're interested in the source, the IOM through its Missing Migrants project collects data on that. Susan, thank you for your point. I suppose I wasn't, it gave the impression I was attacking Stephen Castles. I think it was just this perspective that migration policies fail, and what you do is you look at I think the article, as I understand it, looks at the kind of outcome and works back. and kind of makes assumptions about what people think they're doing. And you know, and I just think on that point that Stephen made, we can actually know more about this and so-called hidden agendas and things like that. I think in the area of migration, agendas are pretty clear. But private actors is a very good point, and actually that when we do this research, what we do is an initial assessment of kind of primary and media sources to identify the people we talk to. So we have categories of actors we're interested in. Private actors are important. We do try and talk to them. It can be difficult to talk to. We've seen their influence. So in South Texas, the incarceration business is a hugely important private actor in US migration and state-level migration through the provision of detention centers and campaign funding for politicians in parts of Texas. So we found that in as part of our work. So it's something we do try to capture. Also, I would add that one thing we've recently discovered is the influence of kind of new media, which I never thought about, but it was inspired by something I saw here in Italy, where a blogger intervened in a way that went viral. Hundreds of thousands of people watched this YouTube video in which he tried to explain that the search and rescue missions, the NGOs working in the Med, were actually operating in a sense as ferry companies, kind of going into water, weren't just intervening to rescue people, they were actually actively transporting people. Now, people would dispute that, but interestingly, I think it's, another actor became involved, and also the influence was on other political actors, particularly on the right here, where it's a very salient political issue, who seized on this kind of representation. And Deirdre's point about the security frame, well, certainly we do. I'm not sure I've got the time to go into it now. I'm very happy to talk about this, but this kind of the ethos and practice of security, particularly through the kind of agencies on which you're an expert, which maybe there might be interesting scope for us to talk about that, and where we're doing lots of kind of ethos and practice of security in Europe, and also through cooperation with other agencies and governance systems operates. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, for a very interesting talk, and thank you for a very engaged discussion. And see you on October 4th, when David will explain what happens when pollsters are wrong and lobbyists win. So, thank you.